Greetings, my name is John Whittington Franklin, and I have the pleasure of working at the Smithsonian Institution's newest museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. With a colleague, Paul Gardulo, a curator and historian at the museum, we decided that Tulsa's story, the story of Greenwood before 1921, during 1921, and after 1921, needed to be told to the nation and the world. So for the past 6 years, Paul and I have come to Tulsa to meet people who work in different institutions, to meet families, individuals that could help us tell that story in Washington. Myself, I have been coming to Tulsa since I was 2 years old. My grandfather was Buck Colbert Franklin. My grandmother was Molly Parker Franklin. They met at Roger Williams University in the fall of 1899, married, moved to southern Oklahoma, moved to Rentersville, and then eventually to Tulsa. We decided that we needed to tell this story in the museum because it's a story of American resilience. African Americans are also often portrayed as victims, but this is a museum that tries to focus on the agency of African Americans. This exhibition will be part of 11 exhibitions in this new museum. And the exhibition where Tulsa's story is told is called The Power of Place, that are place and time specific stories, to give our visitors the understanding of the regional variation in the African American experience, the North, the South, the East, the West, the Midwest, and at different times. Now, to get us to Switzerland and why we told the story in Switzerland, I have to go back to 2007. My work for the museum entails travel across the United States and in many parts of the world. And I was representing the museum in 2007 at the opening of the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Liverpool, England, having been the greatest slave trading port in the world. Close to 5,000 ships left Liverpool laden with goods to take to Africa, to be traded for Africans, and then eventually those Africans are taken to the Americas, and those ships return to Liverpool full of cotton, textiles, sugars, and other products of the Americas. So Liverpool is a sister city of Richmond and a sister city of Benin, Cotonou, Benin. And so at this opening, in northern England, I hear some American accents at this interfaith service. And I go to where I can hear these people. I said, "Excuse me, where are you from?" They said, "We're from Richmond." And so I start to meet my colleagues who live not far from me here in the United States, as far away in Liverpool. I next see these people who are members of a group called Initiatives of Change in Tulsa at the first annual John Hope Franklin Reconciliation in America Symposium. They've been invited because they're specialists in bringing together parts of a community that don't talk to each other. Richmond thinks its story is unique, the former capital of the Confederacy, and the blacks and whites in Richmond haven't spoken to each other for decades, if not centuries. So they're specialists in building trust, and they've come to Tulsa to teach us some of those techniques. These gentlemen are Sylvester Turner and Robert Corcoran. They next invite me to come to Richmond to be part of their dialogues, not only to share the history of the National African American Museum, but to be involved in the trust building they are building across community lines in Richmond. And I visit there for several years to different kinds of programs geared at youth, programs geared at adults, programs that are for graduate students. It's a very interesting set of experiences. Then they invite me to come to an annual conference that takes place in Switzerland at their headquarters in Caux, Switzerland, up the mountain from Montreux off of Lake Geneva. The Kellogg Foundation at the time has made a major commitment to combating racism and combating the notion of a racial hierarchy. So in 2013, they sponsored one of the 5 summer conferences in Co called Healing History. And this conference brings together Americans of all different backgrounds to talk about how knowing each other's history helps us get along better as a nation and as a community. They're Asian Americans, they're Latin Americans, they're African Americans, they're European Americans, they're Native Americans, all with different stories within the United States. My wife Karen joins me on that, and we learn in Co that every individual becomes part of a community which not only discusses the issues, but we work together to maintain the operation of the hotel, the castle. I love to cook, so I always seek the opportunity to cook with other people. I'm also a French speaker, so I joined the French-speaking community. And I had people from Niger, Chad, Burundi, Rwanda, Mali, as well as French-speaking Swiss, French people, and French Canadians. I was the only North American, US American in the French-speaking group. So the focus every day is the different aspect of healing history. And there are people from all over the world at this conference. The next year, I'm invited back to lead the French-speaking group at a different conference called Just Governance for Human Security. And at that session, Sylvester Turner and I do a workshop called Healing History. He's speaking about Richmond, trying to bring Black and white communities together in Richmond, and me talking about the Tulsa experience. And a young woman, Shante Abegaz, who's African American, married to an Ethiopian, is on the staff planning the Just Governance Conference. Her mother's from Tulsa. Her mother went to Booker T. I'm not sure at what point her mother passed, but her mother passes relatively recently. Shante hears me and Sylvester Turner speak about Richmond and Tulsa respectively. And she says, this is a story that really needs to be heard more broadly. And so she approaches me and asks if I can develop a program over 2 years to discuss Tulsa with a diverse group of people from Tulsa, to discuss Tulsa in the 2016 conference and the 2017 conference. I've been working with the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation, attending the symposia every year in May around the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, as well as coming to the community dinner every November, where people are asked to sit next to people they do not know. So, through the range of institutions and individuals and families I've met over the course of my work with Paul creating the exhibition on Tulsa, I'm looking to bring a mixed racial group, men and women, young and old, to talk about Tulsa and its present and future from different vantage points. Initially, I had hoped that Paul Gardullo, the curator, could come. He had to stay behind in Washington to receive artifacts from a slave shipwreck that went down off of Cape Town. And he had to organize a formal ceremony with the embassies of South Africa, Mozambique, and Brazil. So he wasn't available. I had asked Lee Johns, one of the early people creating the John F. Franklin Center. She was not available. Kathy Taylor, the former mayor, was not available. So nonetheless, I put together an interesting group, which I led, John Franklin. I had asked my wife, Karen Roberts Franklin, who's been coming to Tulsa since 1992, just after we were married, and she learned about Tulsa from my father, John Hope Franklin. I then asked Jan Christopher, whose family, the Williams family, owned the Dreamland Theater and the hotel, rooming house, and lost the most material in the destruction of the massacre of 1921. Alicia Latimer, I had worked with not only her being on the board of the John Hope Franklin Center, but the public library had been very supportive of our efforts to tell the story of Tulsa. So Alicia, working at Rudisill, I invited to come and join our delegation. Kathy Taylor suggested that Susan Savage might be a good person to invite, another former mayor who indeed was the first mayor to apologize for the massacre. Shante grew up with the other Alicia Latimer, and so invited her. So the two Alicia Latimers actually meet in Co. They did not know each other in Tulsa. The very first symposium I attended in Tulsa had an incredible presentation by Vanessa Adams Harris, an actor who plays the role written for her by Hannibal Johnson, Big Mama Speaks, in which she plays the role of a massacre survivor who's over 100 years old. Very powerful tale. We asked Michelle Place, the director of the Tulsa Historical Society, to join us. We worked with her and her colleagues to obtain important documents that we've copied for use in the exhibition. I've been impressed by the challenge Tulsa history teachers and social studies teachers face in teaching a story that many of them have not heard about growing up in Tulsa. So as adults, they've had to learn about the massacre and then teach it to young people. I asked for recommendations, and it was unanimous that Anthony Marshall should be at least considered among the teachers, a history teacher at Booker T. Washington, to come to join the delegation. And last but not least, Jan Christopher first was talking to her sister about coming, and then she and her sister decided it would be a wonderful opportunity for their nephew, Byron Clement, rising sophomore at the University of North Texas in jazz studies and a bass player, to join us. So we're anchored by the graybeards like me down to young people like Byron. My goal was to have the diversity of this experience discussed by a broad committee, a broad delegation, and ideally I wanted them to talk to each other after the trip and during the trip. Paul and I went to Tulsa at the end of May for this year's John Hope Franklin Reconciliation in America Symposium and showed the audience what the exhibition at the museum will look like. We included some rare silent footage of the actual destruction, and then talked about the kinds of artifacts and oral histories we've been able to collect from these different institutions and individuals. So people in the delegation began to talk to each other before they left the United States. Goal number one, get people talking to each other. The presentations went very well. On Friday, the 15th of July, Susan Savage and I began in a plenary session. Each day at the conference opens with a plenary session, and this particular plenary session was on the root causes of extremism. Now, at an international conference in 2016, extremism usually comes up in the form of radical Islam, jihad, and the radicalization of young people going to fight for ISIS. We have some of that in the United States, but that was not the focus of the root causes of the Tulsa massacre. So I began the plenary talking about white supremacy, the jealousy between blacks and Indians who had wealth and land with petroleum versus poor whites who did not have that wealth. Black Wall Street, Greenwood, developed with furriers, jewelry stores, restaurants, oil leasing places, professional offices. Very different from most African American communities in the United States. That's why it's called Black Wall Street. So each person had a different perspective to give. Susan and I first spoke at the plenary, and then we had a 2-hour workshop where everyone in the delegation had the opportunity to talk from their vantage point. And then the day ended with the rich presentation by Vanessa Adams Harris of Big Mama Speaks. The audience was very diverse, multilingual, and fascinated by a story they had not heard. We were most approached by the Armenians who wanted to discuss the issue of Armenian genocide and how that history has been suppressed and what the challenges in the 21st century to tell their story. So Tulsa story is unique, but it is a story that the world wants to know about. We've completed the first year, and next year we will have part 2 of Tulsa in Switzerland.